All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Estrada, and this is Engineering Ethics at NJIT. It's March 7th, and this is the Lesson 8 Hangout. Let me jump into the lesson. All right, so we're on Lesson 8. This week is Deepwater Horizon oil spill. If you checked YouTube earlier, or the Moodle earlier today, you might have seen that my video was taken down because of a copyright claim. There's this little animation from one of the documentaries that there's a little animation from one of the documentaries that I had you watch, and I show it in the lecture, and YouTube took down my video for a copyright claim. So for most of today, it was taken down. I just disputed the claim. I don't know if that's going to go through, so it might get taken down again. But the video's up right now. I think I'm going to have to switch all of my videos to some other hosting service, because educational use should be fair use. It's technically a kind of fair use, so I'm legally allowed to show the video, but YouTube automatically takes down things that match copyright claims. Lesson 8, Deepwater Horizon oil spill is this week. Last week, you wrote on the NSPE Code of Ethics, and you all did case studies from the Board of Ethical Review. There were some interesting case studies that you all looked at. I don't know if you want to take a look at any of the cases, if anyone wants to talk about a case they looked at last week. Remember, you have your replies due tonight. So if anyone wants to talk about a case that they did last week, please mention it. What I wanted to do for today's Hangout was mention another case that's in the news right now, which is Uber. Uber is having basically the worst year ever. Lots of problems with Uber over the last year. And I wanted to mention it for this class because there's a variety of ethical challenges that Uber is facing. And in particular, one of them was a whistleblowing case. And so if you're paying attention to the Uber case in the news, you might find this interesting. One of the engineers whistleblowed. So I wanted to go over just the situation Uber is in right now. It's a nice, from the headlines, case of engineering ethics. So I'm going to go over the Uber case. If you want to talk about the Uber case for your research project in a couple of weeks, I'm only going to say a few brief things, but if you want to go into more detail, that would be something you're able to do. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about Uber, unless anyone has any questions or any other comments about the class. Please interrupt if you do. I'll leave a message in chat. I'll go ahead and say right now that the secret word for the Hangout today is Uber. If you put Uber into the Hangout attendance credit, you'll get attendance credit for the Hangout. Yeah, so let's talk about Uber. So Uber's been having a terrible year. The year started bad after the immigration ban. So when Trump put up the immigration ban, one of the things that Uber did in response to the immigration ban was put discount rates for getting picked up at the airport. Right? After the immigration ban, all the taxi cabs were, there was a big protest. A bunch of protesters went to all the airports all across the country. And they blocked all the airports, and the taxi companies working at the airports joined the protest and refused to pick people up. So a lot of people were sort of left stranded at the airport. And Uber's response to this, they saw it as an opportunity. So they lowered the surge charges to airports so that people could get cheaper rides from the airport. As a result of this action, there was a big protest, sort of the delete Uber hashtag. So a lot of people were upset at Uber for going against the immigration the protesters at the airports. So there was a big delete Uber push where some like 200,000 people over a couple of days left Uber. Not only did people leave Uber, but Lyft, which is one of Uber's major competitors, donated like $1 million to the ACLU or something. I think it was the ACLU. immediately after the travel ban, right? So Uber makes this move against the protesters, and then Lyft, Uber's major competitor, does this big generous action supporting the protesters. And this all culminates into this big Delete Uber campaign where a lot of people leave Uber. So this was the first mark against Uber. One of Uber's responses after this was to apologize. They took down their original tweet. They apologized for going against the protesters. They had a big statement about how they support immigrants and they think the immigration ban is wrong. They donated $3 million to legal support of immigrants. So they had to do this big sort of mea culpa, an apology as a result. So that was the first big thing that happened to Uber at the beginning of this year. While they were still reeling from this, very shortly after that, Susan Fowler, who was a site reliability engineer at Uber, she left Uber in December. She joined a different company in January. And then in February, she wrote this long letter where she discusses lots of problems with the way that Uber runs its staff, in particular sexual harassment problems. She was sexually harassed. Can people hear me? My video just crashed. I don't know if it's still, it looks like it's still recording. I'm not exactly sure what happened. I just want to make sure that people can still hear. Yeah, good. Okay. Let me go back into the screen. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, so Uber has this bad customer service thing in early January, and then Susan Fowler, one of the site reliability engineers, talks about sexual harassment in the workplace and just general organizational problems in the workplace, but especially sexual harassment, where she was sexually harassed by some of her coworkers, and when she went to complain about it to her managers basically dismissed her, didn't take it seriously, didn't want to trouble the high-performing sales reps and other people in the company that she was accusing. So the company took the side of the people who she was accusing of sexual harassment, and this went on for a few months, and then she ends up finding other people at Uber who had the same experience. And in fact, after she posts this letter, other people who, both former employees at Uber and current employees at Uber, came out to reiterate and reinforce her claims. So she doesn't work there anymore. So she's not going to get fired by them. She's already left the job. She already has a new job. But this is a kind of this is a whistleblowing act because she has. So remember, whistleblowers have to have had some experience with the company, and so she worked there for a long time. So she's a whistleblower. This is a whistleblowing document, and it has generated a lot of discussion over the last few weeks about sexual harassment problems, both at Uber and in Silicon Valley generally, in the tech industry generally. So this stuff just happened in the last few weeks, and I think I'm going to put it up on our syllabus for future semesters to look at more explicitly, probably when we go over the whistleblowing section. But if you're interested, you might want to read Susan's whistleblowing note here, because I mean it gives you right up to the present moment whistleblowing experience from a real working engineer at the kind of job that you might yourself want one day. So Susan Fowler releases this whistleblowing against Uber. Very shortly after that, I didn't pull this up. Yeah, so very shortly after the whistleblowing piece goes out, it turns out that one of Uber's executives had formerly been employed at Google and was fired at Google for sexual harassment issues. And apparently he went to go work at Uber afterwards. Uber was not aware of the reasons why he got fired. And so when this came out, Uber had to fire its chief executive. So this is bad PR for Uber, one step after another. Almost immediately following this, just a few days after the whistleblowing, video comes out of the CEO of Uber taking an Uber and getting into a big argument with the driver of the car about how he's handling Uber. Oops. Yeah, so the CEO's in the back. He gets into a big yelling match with the driver, where the driver is accusing him of running the company poorly, and he starts yelling. And so they get into this big argument. The CEO totally handles himself inappropriately here, especially since, I mean, it might be because of all the other sort of political pressure on the CEO at this point, but he has this explosion, very public explosion, right, compounding these PR problems. And then on top of all of that, Uber gets hit with a bunch of legal troubles. So it turns out that Uber was not legal in its self-driving car experiments. So it was doing these experiments. Remember, it released a bunch of self-driving cars in, I want to say, Pittsburgh. But the testing that it did was not legal. It wasn't in compliance with the law when it was doing this. So this just came out. In addition to this, Google and other self-driving car companies have started a lawsuit against Uber for stealing some of its technical secrets. So yeah, so Waymo is Google's self-driving car division. And Waymo filed lawsuits against Uber for stealing a bunch of its technical proprietary technologies. So now Uber is embroiled in a bunch of lawsuits, has all this PR problems. One other thing that just recently came out was that it turns out that Uber had a system called Grayball that it was using to deliberately avoid picking up law enforcement agents or other people who might be trying to police the Uber cars. So they had techniques for avoiding the cops. So all of these stories came out in just the last month or so, and it's been a huge nightmare for Uber. It's an open question whether how long they're going to survive. Uber is not a publicly traded corporation. Uber is still a private company, and I think all their money is coming from angel investors. And as far as I know, Uber has not turned a profit on any of that money. So all of this bad news is sort of hitting Uber like a ton of bricks. So I just wanted to call out the case. I wanted to especially draw attention to Susan Fowler's whistleblowing as a site reliability engineer for Uber. I don't know if anyone still in the chat has been paying attention to this case or has any comments on what's been happening to Uber. In this class, we will be talking about Uber and other sort of sharing economy technologies later on in the semester when we talk about technological unemployment, robots taking our jobs. Right? Uber is supposed to be an example of one of these transition companies towards the robots taking our jobs. And there's reasons to be skeptical about the business model that Uber is using, and we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But all of that might not be relevant in a couple of weeks because Uber might be out of business pretty soon. So let me open it up to the chat. I don't know if anyone has any comments or thoughts. All right, so no comments from the group. So usually on these Hangouts, I talk about what happened last week. Or in the lesson from last week, lesson 7, you did the NSP Code of Ethics for Engineers. A lot of you covered some interesting cases. There's some interesting analysis on the website. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts about the cases you studied? Want to share any of the cases? I know there's not so many people in the chat right now. Or a question about any of the cases. I did see quite a few people who disagreed with the NSP Board of Review analysis. Actually, let me just talk about one case. I think I left a comment on it. I don't remember which forum it was in, but one student did a case study, and the way the case study worked was it was an engineer who was licensed in one state was visiting a friend who was in a different state where he wasn't licensed, where the engineer was not licensed, but the engineer ends up giving engineering advice about some business proposal to the friend in this other state. And because the engineer wasn't licensed in that state, the engineer is brought up on charges of unethical behavior, that he's operating outside of his area of competence, outside of his jurisdiction. This is one of the cases where the student was critical of the Board of Ethical Review's analysis of the case. They said, the Board of Ethical Review said that the engineer acted unethically for giving engineering advice in a state where he wasn't licensed. And it referred to the Code of Ethics policies on acting only in your area of competence to justify the ruling. And the student thought that this was unfair. The student said that, look, the engineer was just giving advice, right? The engineer wasn't actually building the project. The engineer was just giving their own technical advice. And there didn't seem to be anything wrong with that. And setting up state boundaries that limit where the engineer can give advice was unfair to the engineer. This is what the student said. And so they disagreed with the Board of Ethical analysis because they thought that the engineer should be allowed to give that advice. Oops. Oops. So this is one of these cases where the student thought that the NSP Board of Review was wrong. I don't know that the Board of Ethical Review was wrong in this case. It seems to me that because the regulations and requirements for different states on the engineers are different, right? The legal requirements, the regulations on building codes and that kind of stuff, because those are different from state to state, that the engineer might be giving incorrect advice by giving advice in a state where they're not licensed. If they don't know all the details of the projects in that state, then they might be giving advice outside of their area of competence. And it's important for engineers to only be giving advice in the area of their competence. So remember, a lot of the ethical codes for engineers has to do with the specialized knowledge that you have, either because of the project that you're working on or just because of your technical background, because you know a bunch of physics. That technical knowledge gives you a special kind of responsibility in cases, to be a faithful trustee of your client, but also to tell the truth, but also to make sure that you're acting within your expertise. If you're acting outside of your expertise, people might still take you for an expert, even though you don't technically have expertise because you're not licensed. Right? And so it's these kinds of troubles that the NSP board is trying to prevent. The case in my mind is that I think it was Europe that sent a rover to Mars, and when they were building the rover, they were collaborating with a group that was doing their math in like feet and inches, and the European group was doing their math in meters and centimeters and so on. And because of the incompatibility, they didn't actually check the incompatibility. when they sent out the Mars probe. And so when the Mars probe got to Mars, it just kept going and smashed into the surface of Mars and lost like hundreds of millions of dollars of technical equipment. And it was just a mistake. It was just a mistake, a conversion mistake, the kind of simple mistake that you make in your introductory physics class. But it was a mistake that professional engineers made that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Right, so those kinds of mistakes could pop up if you're giving engineering advice outside of your expertise, right? If you don't know that there's some, regulation or restriction in the state that you're talking in because you're not licensed there, then you might end up making one of these little mistakes that could end up costing lots of money or lots of time or even some lives. So. Okay, I feel like I've rambled on engineering codes and Uber stuff for long enough. If no one else has anything to say, I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Next week in the Hangout, we'll talk a little bit more about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Now that the video is back up online, you can watch my lecture. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill next week. Next week, we'll also do climate change and geoengineering, which would be fun. Any last questions, comments, thoughts about grades or any of the assignment structure? That's okay, Amaka. There's no time restrictions. The secret word for the day was Uber. We spent a lot of time talking about Uber, recent legal difficulties and public relations difficulties. I guess one last thing I'll say, so next week we do climate change and geoengineering, and then lesson 10, so this week is lesson 8, next week is lesson 9, week after that is lesson 10, and lesson 10 is your own research project week, where you're going to be asked to find your own case study and do some scholarly research to present your case to the rest of the class. The research project this week on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is supposed to be an example case study, and you're going to need to put together comparable materials for your own case study. It can't be any of the cases that we've looked at in class already. It can't be the Pinto case, the Challenger case, or Deepwater Horizon. But any other case you should feel free to look up. I give you some example cases in lesson 10. And that assignment is going to be due in 2 weeks on the 31st. So you probably want to start working on that now, thinking about that right now. Axel says, I think a lot of the problems in these cases were related to communications problems between engineers and big parties such as management, right? That's right. Between the engineers on one hand and the management on the other, and there's usually people even higher than the management, so the upper management like CEOs, but also political pressure. So in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, we'll talk about this more. I talk about this in the lecture, and we'll talk about this more next week. But a lot of the political pressure was coming from the elected representatives, right? So the senators from Louisiana and other Gulf states, right? The senators there are actively being corrupted by the energy department, right? So BP spends a lot of money, it gives a lot of money to the elected representatives from the Gulf Coast states, and that gives them a lot of political influence in those states, right? And so, and the managers and politicians and everyone on top, and the engineers who are actually doing the work have a lot of attention. So in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, it's a great case where the engineer comes to the managers, and in the articles you can actually see the email that the engineer wrote to the managers, where they explain that they need a certain number of centralizers, that their computer models show that this drilling operation will only be safe if they have, I think, 21 centralizers, and they only had 6 centralizers on hand. And you can see the management go, well, we don't have time to put those extra centralizers in, so just go through with the project anyway. And they do, and it causes one of the biggest environmental disasters in history. Smith says, I think this will always be a problem in any company because of this various problems occur. I think that's absolutely right. That these kinds of communication problems and these kinds of tensions between management and engineers will always occur in any company. And I mean, part of the difference is that the cases that we're talking about are the cases where this blows up into a major problem, like a huge environmental disaster. Although these problems come up in the business world all the time, they usually don't blow up into these major scandals or these major disasters. And so you want to be thinking about this. One thought you might have is just that we should improve our communication issues to prevent these major disasters. But most of these communication issues don't result in major disasters. They just result in sort of everyday conflicts, sort of workplace conflicts. The other approach is not to think that the goal is to prevent these disasters from occurring, but rather just to recognize that communication is always going to be a problem. There's always going to be tensions between managers and engineers and the rest of the staff. And if you know that these problems are always going to occur, then you can set up ahead of time to try to minimize the damage from them. One way of doing this is to be in constant good communication, right? Just sort of practice communication skills in the sense of talking to people, making sure that your interests and your worries are being expressed and acknowledged by the people you're working with. Oh, there's some more in the chat. Yeah, so Smith says, I think it'll always be a problem in companies because of the various problems that occur. For the Deepwater Horizon, they had 45 days. Axel says, I feel the problems are also because management doesn't listen to engineers. It's about half and half with how engineers act and the decisions they make as well. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Okay, so what I think for Alex's comment is like, that is true that engineers and management, they always have some problem with them, but the problem occurs because that management thinks that whatever engineers do is like, management thinks that they are the ultimate authorities and whatever they decide is true. So they think that management, like the engineers are lower to them, and the engineers are trying to do this to gain some acknowledgement and gain some like for that personal gain basically. And so many of the times, like many of the cases which I read during the last week, I saw that was the problem, that yeah, management thinks that the engineer wants to do it for the personal gains, but that is not the case. And so management disregards whatever the engineer comments on their ideas and everything.
Good, thank you. That was helpful. I wonder, so the claim was that that the management sort of just doesn't trust the engineers because they think the engineers are in it for their own personal benefits. And the management has to worry not just about what the engineers think, but has to worry about what's good for the company generally. And sometimes making those business decisions put them against, sort of in conflict with the engineers. But I wonder, so in the challenger case, remember the take off your management hat or engineering hat, put on your management hat. The worry wasn't that the engineers were being selfish or that they were being self-interested. The worry was just that the engineers were overblowing the problem, right? So the engineers thought that the O-rings were a much bigger problem than they really were, and the management was thinking that, well, I mean, it's a very small part. It's a very small part of the whole operation. Maybe that's not a big enough issue to prevent the launch, right? So it's not that the manager, from the manager position, it wasn't that the engineers were being selfish. It's just that they didn't have the proper perspective. They needed to have a bigger picture of what was going on, right? So maybe the engineers want to put all the fancy stuff on the on the device, on the rocket or whatever. You want to put all the fanciest equipment, but the managers are going to know that you can't just do everything fancy. You also have to be worried about the budget and time considerations and so on. And so how do you manage all these concerns? Yeah, so Axel says the best way to prevent these incidents just like that is a mutual understanding of the roles of both parties. So the engineers should respect and understand management. Yeah, I wonder, it would be interesting if someone could find a case where it was the engineer. I don't think we have a case like this in our syllabus, where it was the engineers who were really at fault and not the management. I guess the closest case we have to this is the VW emission scandal, because the device had to be specially rigged by engineers to be giving the false information. So engineers were deeply involved, but engineers definitely were not doing that alone. They would not have been doing that if the management wasn't telling them to do that kind of project. So it would be interesting if anyone could find, when you're doing your own case studies, if you can find a case where it was the engineer who really makes the wrong decision, and that the managers have to step in and stop them if there's a case like that. Yeah, so he's saying, so the engineers should respect and understand what management expects of them, and management should understand that what engineers bring up as any issue that, of course, can and will most likely blow up in the end. Yeah, I don't want to defend management, but I guess management is going to see the position just that the engineers have too narrow of a focus, that they're focused only on solving the engineering challenge, right? Solving the physics of it, and not about the larger business environment in which that device is operating. But yeah, everyone in chat is definitely right that it's a challenge of mutual understanding and understanding where people are coming at a problem from different perspectives with different values, different interests. Yeah, good. Any other thoughts, comments? I think I'll put some of these links to the Uber cases in the chat, or in the open thread for the week. And we'll talk more about Deepwater Horizon after you all have watched the videos and read some more of the material. We'll talk about that next week. All right, if you have no other questions, I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for the conversation.